The gates to the Veterans Memorial slammed shut, locked forever by an unseen hand, silencing a community's grief and honor. Families wept, soldiers' sacrifices buried beneath cold government silence. But behind the shadows of secrecy, a fierce battle was about to ignite. What happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. John Matthews sat alone on the cold bench at the edge of the empty park, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the untouched grass. His hands, calloused from years of service, clenched into tight fists resting on his knees. The silence around him was heavy, oppressive, a stark contrast to the roaring chaos he had once faced overseas. But this silence was no relief. It was the sound of a dream shattered, of a promise broken. He had poured every ounce of his energy into this memorial project. It wasn't just stone and plaque to John, it was a sanctuary, a tangible acknowledgement of the sacrifices made by his brothers and sisters in arms. Each name etched into that monument would represent more than just a casualty statistic. It would embody lives lived with honor, families left behind, and stories too heavy for words. John's vision had stirred something deep in the community. Neighbors who had never met a soldier found themselves moved to contribute, share stories, and rally for this tribute. Veterans, their faces weathered and worn, spoke openly about the healing power such a place could bring. This park was to be a place where pain found respect, where the invisible wounds of war might find some solace. Yet now, that vision lay crushed beneath a cold, impenetrable wall of bureaucracy. The letter from the Pentagon was brief, sterile, an abrupt decree that the park would be closed permanently due to unspecified security concerns. No hearings, no chance to appeal, no transparency. Just a final, ironclad denial. John's mind kept replaying the moment he first heard the news, the sting of disbelief giving way to a fury so intense it burned beneath his skin. How could the very institution he had sworn to defend turn its back on those it owed so much? How could it dismiss the memories of the fallen, the needs of grieving families, as if they were nothing but collateral damage in a shadowed game of power? The local officials, whom John had trusted to fight on behalf of the community, had folded quickly under federal pressure. Their voices were muted, their excuses vague. Jurisdictional issues, national security protocols, confidential risk assessments. But to John, those were empty words masking a deeper indifference. The bureaucracy had become a fortress, impenetrable and cold, indifferent to the human cost it inflicted. He saw in their eyes a helplessness that felt too much like surrender. The people who should have stood with the veterans had backed away, leaving John and the families of fallen soldiers to confront this injustice alone. Watching those families break down as they heard the news was unbearable. Mothers who had lost sons and daughters, widows whose husbands' stories would never be told in public, children who would never hear their parents' names spoken with honor, all crushed beneath a silence imposed by faceless authorities. The park was supposed to be their refuge, a place to gather, remember, and heal. Instead, it had become a symbol of denial, of erasure. John's heart twisted in grief as he imagined the hollow emptiness they must feel, a wound deeper than any battlefield injury. This was no ordinary setback. It was a betrayal so profound that it shook John's very identity. He had fought for a country that promised to honor its defenders, yet here was proof that those promises were paper thin. The anger that surged inside him was mingled with an aching pain, the knowledge that sacrifice alone was not enough to guarantee dignity or respect. It was a bitter pill to swallow for a man who had given everything. John Matthews was not just mourning the lost park, he was mourning the loss of faith in the system he had believed in. As dusk settled over the forbidden ground, John stood slowly, his jaw clenched with determination. The fight was far from over. The silence around the park was heavy, but it was not the final word. Somewhere beyond the walls of power and protocol, the truth waited to be uncovered, and with it, the hope that justice could still be reclaimed. John Matthews felt the weight of the denial like a stone in his chest, but surrender was never in his nature. The cold decree closing the park had ignited something fierce within him, a fire that would not be extinguished by sterile letters or veiled warnings. His vision of a memorial wasn't just a personal quest. It had become a collective heartbeat shared by veterans, families, and neighbors who refused to let their sacrifices be swept into obscurity. With grim determination, John threw himself into the struggle to reclaim what had been stolen, not just a patch of land, but a symbol of respect and remembrance. He began by reaching out to every contact he had built through years of service and community work. Veterans organizations answered his call with urgency, their members recognizing the battle he now faced mirrored their own long-fought fights for recognition and dignity. Families of the fallen, still raw with grief, found a voice in John's leadership, channeling sorrow into action. Together they formed a coalition that transcended politics and divisions, united by a singular mission: to restore the park, to restore honor. Rallies were organized in town squares and outside government buildings. The air buzzed with chants and banners, voices rising in unison against an invisible adversary. Petitions swelled with thousands of signatures, each name a testament to the park's profound meaning. Local media began to cover the story, painting John not as a disgruntled veteran, but as a man fighting for the soul of a community. Interviews with families revealed the deep wounds inflicted by the closure, stories of loss, of memories tethered to that sacred ground. Yet, despite the growing tide of public support, the Pentagon's stance hardened. Colonel Stevens, the official spokesperson, embodied the implacable face of federal authority. His statements were measured, devoid of sympathy, grounded in the unwavering logic of security imperatives. According to Stevens, the closure was mandated by classified security protocols connected to a nearby military installation. The park, he argued, posed an unacceptable risk that could not be compromised by public gatherings, regardless of their intent. National security, he insisted, must take precedence over local grief and veteran recognition. From John's perspective, Stevens was a barrier, an immovable monolith enforcing policy with cold detachment, a reminder that bureaucracy often erased the human element in its quest for control. Stevens's role was clear: enforce the rules, not engage with the pain they caused. The lines of communication grew terse and formal, the dialogue reduced to official statements and legal posturing. Every attempt John made to negotiate or plead was met with carefully crafted responses that sidestepped the heart of the matter. Frustration mounted like a tidal wave. Each bureaucratic obstacle felt like a stone wall rising higher, suffocating the momentum of the grassroots movement. John's rallies, petitions, and public appeals seemed to echo into an unyielding void. The anger that had once burned bright began to flicker under the strain of endless resistance. Then, unexpectedly, a crack appeared in the fortress of opposition. Sarah, a young Pentagon analyst, herself a veteran, began to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of power with quiet resolve. Unlike the rigid spokesperson, Sarah saw the closure not as an absolute necessity, but as a painful overreach. She recognized in John's mission a truth often lost in classified files and cold policy, that behind every security protocol were real people, real losses, and real hope. Sarah's compassion became a lifeline, a clandestine force working within the system to challenge the closure from the inside. She gathered intelligence, sifted through regulations, and quietly advocated for reconsideration. Her position was precarious. Any misstep could end her career, but her conviction was unwavering. In her, John found more than an ally. He found renewed hope that the walls might be breached, that justice might yet prevail. The fight was no longer just in the streets or on paper. It had seeped into the shadows of the very institutions that sought to silence it. And in that shadowed fight, John felt the stirrings of something powerful, an emerging possibility that the impossible could still be undone. The moment the classified documents surfaced, the atmosphere inside the Pentagon shifted palpably. Though no announcement was made that day, Sarah had worked tirelessly behind closed doors to unearth the truth buried beneath layers of outdated protocols and forgotten fears. What she found was undeniable. The park's closure rested on security concerns from a decade earlier, concerns that had since been mitigated or rendered irrelevant by technological advances and changes in military operations. These revelations were more than a quiet victory. They were a catalyst for upheaval. When Sarah and John chose to present this evidence publicly, the response was immediate and electric. The media seized on the story. A government entity had silenced a community's tribute to its heroes based on phantom threats. The narrative crystallized around a stark contrast: the cold, bureaucratic dismissal of veterans' sacrifices versus the raw, heartfelt demands for justice from those who served and their families. Press conferences swelled with reporters, cameras flashing, voices clamoring for answers. John's voice, once muffled by frustration, now carried the weight of vindication. He spoke not just as a veteran, but as a representative of countless others whose service had been overlooked. His words resonated with a nation hungry for stories of courage and truth. The park, once a symbol of denial and neglect, transformed overnight into a beacon of resilience and collective will. Pentagon officials scrambled to contain the fallout. Colonel Stevens, previously unwavering, found himself cornered by irrefutable evidence and mounting public pressure. The institution that had seemed invincible now faced calls for transparency and accountability from lawmakers, veterans groups, and citizens alike. The narrative had flipped. This was no longer a matter of classified security. It was a test of integrity and respect for those who risked everything for their country. The decision to reopen the park came swiftly, but the announcement carried the gravity of a long-fought battle. The reopening was not merely procedural, it was ceremonial, emblematic of restored faith between a government and its people. The day of the ribbon-cutting ceremony arrived with a palpable sense of triumph. Veterans from across the region gathered, many with hands trembling from years of silent grief and unresolved anger. Families of the fallen brought photos, letters, and worn uniforms, their presence a testament to the enduring power of remembrance. John stood at the forefront, the sunlight catching the tears that welled in his eyes. His journey, from the initial spark of hope, through the crushing despair into relentless struggle, had culminated in this moment of profound restoration. The park's gates, once barred and forbidding, now opened wide, welcoming all who sought solace and honor. Each blade of grass, each carved name on the newly installed plaques, whispered stories of sacrifice and courage renewed. This victory rippled far beyond the boundaries of the park. News outlets carried the story nationwide, inspiring communities to reevaluate their own commitments to veterans. John's relentless fight became a symbol of how ordinary people could confront institutions, demand accountability, and reclaim dignity for those who served. The park was no longer just land. It was a monument to resilience, a testament that even the most entrenched systems could bend to justice when challenged with truth and passion. In the weeks that followed, the memorial blossomed into a gathering place where past wounds found healing, where veterans shared stories amid the shade of old oaks, and where children learned the cost of freedom. John's vision had transcended the physical space. It had sparked a movement, a collective awakening to the sacred duty owed to those who wear the uniform. The park stood as an unbreakable symbol, forever etched into the landscape of a nation's conscience, reminding all that justice, when pursued with unwavering resolve, can restore what was once thought lost.